Okay, so this is a video to recap and explain and just cover the things we did in today's session actually on feminism. And this time I've called it lesson three. Strictly speaking, it's lesson four, but it's about intersectionality and what we're going to call third wave feminism. And additionally, we're going to look at a key thinker, another key thinker, Bell Hooks, who's our second one. So we normally think about this. I normally throw these pictures on the desks and get people to tell us, how is this changing the way in which we think about feminism? And you can see these days, if you look at a demonstration, particularly in America, but elsewhere as well, you will see the word intersectional used time and time again on people's placards and for protests. And it's a really interesting one because it's actually only just appeared in things like Merriam-Webster's dictionary. That was in 2017. We've probably been using it when we talk about feminism for the last 20 odd years or so. And the impression that people will get when they see this is that clearly what this is doing is getting people to think about the, the fact that the experience of women isn't all the same, and that there may be differences between the way in which white women experience feminism, experience oppression, and black women experience oppression, and other groups of people experiencing oppression as well. This is Audre Lorde, who's a civil rights activist and feminist, who I think sums it up quite nicely when she says that if any woman is unfree, then she herself is not free, even though her shackles are very different, and therefore different experiences of oppression. That's going to be the big way to remember this intersectionality. But we're going to define it, put some kind of like detail around it, and then make some evaluation of it as we go through today. And this one does something similar as well. And then we're going to do so by starting actually this time with bell hooks and then coming back to the idea of feminism. So let's do that. We need first to think about why it is that people like bell hooks and why the third wave came about in the first place. And it does so as a response to second wave feminism. So let's recap on what we think we mean by second wave feminism. This incorporates the ideas of the kind of core ideas, some of them that we looked at before. But this is a picture of Betty Friedan. Betty Friedan was she's often described as the mother of feminism in the 1960s, and she is a leading exponent, kind of repopularizing Simone de Beauvoir's ideas, but then using them to explain the position of women in America in the 1960s. So what was she saying? In her book, The Feminine Mystique, one of the things she talks about right at the beginning is that, here are women lying next to their husbands in bed at night, looking at the ceiling, thinking, is this it? So that despite the fact that they have political and legal equality, despite the fact that they have access to divorce and they can vote and that their property is seen in the same way, when we look at the lives of women in the 1960s as housewives who are primarily looking after children, not financially independent, living quite constrained existences in which they're conditioned to try and be the best housewife they can be. The question mark is like, why isn't life more fulfilling? And one of the things that Betty Friedan does is point to the massive increase in mental health issues among women in the 1960s and 70s, depression, and all sorts of other things about unhappiness, lack of fulfillment. So one of the things she's arguing for is that for women to be properly fulfilled, they have to be able to get access to equal opportunities, to work and financial independence, but also sexual liberation as well. And that's to do with the way in which they see themselves as promiscuous sexual beings, or potentially promiscuous if they choose to be, to have reproductive rights, which is a feature of that, having control of their own bodies so that they can be experience their own lives through sexual liberation as well. And that requires a change in consciousness, women's consciousness and men's as well. So far, so familiar to us because we've been thinking about these things already. So what happens next then? Well, the question mark is, there are some big criticisms of the second wave. The first one comes from difference feminists. Now, we want to say here that this is not about different women's experience. Difference feminists are a kind of radical feminist who reject the idea that gender and sexuality and sex rather are simply male constructs, that in fact they do think that there's something significantly different about men and women, and that those characteristics that they have, that women have, are actually not things that they want to be to have their consciousness changed about them, but they want to celebrate womanhood. And they want to celebrate the fact that women may have some qualities which are different from men's, perhaps even better than men's as well. So emotional intelligence, the ability to be rational, particularly later on when we think about things like, I think eco-feminists are a really good example of this as well. That, you know, for eco-feminists as difference feminists, they think of women as naturally being, because they're mothers, as naturally being more able to be custodians, more able to understand the nature of the world as something which should have continuity and shouldn't just be exploited in the here and now, and should be passed on to children as well. And that, for them, is something that men lack. So that the essential qualities of women being different from men is something which second wave feminists didn't recognize, difference feminists want to. This is probably the one we're going to talk about most today, which is about postmodern feminists. And most importantly, as Audre Lorde was talking about, different women experience oppression differently. And so we want to look at different types of womanhood, not just one experience, one common experience of women's oppression. And within that, we're also going to think about gender as well, and about the kind of, or at least about the extent to which woman, being a woman, is on a kind of continuum. So through which there are lots of different types of women, and through which women may move at different times of their lives as well. Being childless, being lesbian, being male or female as well as another way of kind of constructing identity, constructing the type of woman that you are. That's what postmodernist feminists are interested in, the ability for women to be able to be free by making the sort of woman that they are. And then finally, we'll address the issue of trans feminists. This is in the news today. J.K. Rowling's in the news for giving back an award because an organization that gave her a human rights award ages ago has then since criticized for being transphobic. So this idea that second wave feminists, not necessarily saying J.K. Rowling's a second wave feminist, but the second wave feminists saw gender in terms of a duality, men versus women, has been superseded as far as lots of trans feminists are concerned by gender fluidity and the possibility for men to become women and for those women also to be seen as full women as well. And therefore they've chosen, or at least been able to resist having a gender imposed on them and chosen a different sort of gender. There's a subjectivity there, which is quite important, I think, for us. Okay, so some big words, but let's get to the middle one, because I think that's the one we're going to concentrate on most with our third wave. So why do we need a third wave of feminism? Well, the movement in the 1960s is mainly led by people who are like Betty Friedan. They're white, middle class. They live middle-class existences, often in suburban areas of, kind of affluent areas of American cities. Their experience is of being a housewife. Now, Betty Friedan's point here was about them being invisible, not being part of the economy, not taking part in work, being kind of hidden away in these kind of suburban, semi-detached houses until their husbands came home later on as well. But for lots of women, that's not even most women's experience. Women in working class neighborhoods, women in working class families and cultures had to go out to work and therefore were not invisible and often in not very nice jobs either, or at least low paid and menial jobs. And they were being exploited. And one of the consequences of the second wave's argument that women should be able to go out to work is that those middle-class women go out to work would then hire some cleaners or hire some nannies to do the things they were being liberated from. And guess who the cleaners and nannies were? Working class, often non-white women, who were now being exploited by middle-class women. So middle-class women's equality was at the expense of greater inequality for working-class black women. And there's also a way in which that in itself, this is not to say that people like Betty Friedan were racist or white supremacist in any way whatsoever, but the movement itself, because it addressed the issues, the concerns of white middle-class women, therefore did not address and excluded attention to the concerns of black women and black working-class women or people of other sorts of oppression as well. Even to the point where second-wave feminists saw themselves in competition with the civil rights movement and progressive movements about segregation and black civil rights, rather than finding ways in which they could include the voice of black women in those movements. So as a footnote to this as well, there's some question mark about the extent to which you to also address the issue of sexuality. And certainly Betty Friedan, some of her comments, I think she would have recanted on these now. But the idea that homosexuality was a kind of distraction, where she was in the business of trying to persuade mainstream Democratic politicians to support her agenda on things like abortion and things like the Equal Rights Amendment. Other things where people came along and talked about homosexuality and so on were making life more difficult to do that job. And so she saw them as a distraction from the main issue. And of course, by extension, that is a kind of institutional homophobia. Okay, so where does that leave us? So our first exponent of third wave feminism in a big way comes from, I'm going to go back a second here because I think I've missed a slide by accident. Our first exponent of this new type of third wave feminism comes from a woman called Bell Hooks. But in order to understand what Bell Hooks was talking about, we need to go back not from the 1980s, but to the 1880s. So look at these words by Sojourner Truth, who was a slave, who then became a freed slave, who then became an anti-slavery campaigner, and it's seen as a kind of giant of the movement. So this statement that she makes, that man over there, she says that women need to be helped into carriages and lifted over ditches, and to have the best place everywhere. But nobody ever helps me get into carriages or over mud puddles or gives me my best place. And ain't I a woman? And you could read the rest of it for yourself, but that's how we should understand this phrase, which becomes the title of Bell Hooks' book. Ain't I a woman as well? Like, you've created this image of what these women are like. Aren't I included in that? And the whole point here for Bell Hooks is about the way in which black womanhood has been devalued in a society which is not only patriarchal, but also white supremacist as well, also values whiteness more than it does blackness as well. In fact, eradicates blackness. So here, what Sojourner Truth's statement was doing was reminding us about some essential qualities that had been associated with black women over the course of the next 100 years or so, I suppose since the existence of slavery in America, that where white women were kind of put on a pedestal and white women were seen as the fairer sex or seen as innocent or had all sorts of characteristics attributed to them, black women were seen as less than that, less than human, not as women at all, but almost like having animal qualities. If you think about slavery, black women were used to breed more slaves, and black women were used simply for the animal sexual gratification of slave owners, not seen as persons in their full right. And Bell Hooks' argument is that slavery casts a long shadow into the 21st century about the way in which people think about black women, the way in which not only white people, white men and white women think about black women, but also black women themselves. So there's a job of work here in order to get people to recognize that oppression, and then to think about how it can be, how black women can achieve liberation. So I've given you a little bit of homework here. It's to go to the Kelly book, which again is on PDF in the classroom on page 132, and to read the text so that you can make your own notes. But I'm going to make a few comments on them now. I've made a little summary for you as well, which you'll be able to see for yourself to show how you can make use of Bell Hooks when we come to write about her. And there's also a little summary of what the book looks like, where I've asked you to look out for these kind of key words. But let me say some comments about Bell Hooks so that we've got the beginnings of an understanding of why she's making the argument that she is. Well, often the first thing that people ask is, why hasn't she got capitals in her name? That's because her real name isn't Bell Hooks, it's Gloria Watkins. And her grandmother, who had been a slave, was called Bell Hooks. And the reason why they're not in capitals is because she, Bell Hooks, wanted people to recognize the ideas themselves as being important, and not to be concentrating on the individual who wrote about them. So the idea is it's supposed to be kind of like getting away from the ego of fame and being famous for your ideas and that kind of thing as well. Ironically, of course, everybody concentrates on why the name is like it is, and really we want to concentrate on the ideas. So I started with this point before, from Sojourner Truth. During slavery, black women are not seen or treated as women. They're treated as if they were livestock, and worse than that, as if they're kind of objects to be exploited sexually as well. White women, on the other hand, are seen as pure, as having kind of feminine, ladylike sorts of qualities, and that gives them a kind of specialized treatment. Here already, then, we should be able to see that Bell Hooks is talking about the fact that there's a position of privilege for white women compared to black women, and that tells us that there can't just be a common experience of female oppression under patriarchy. And that black womanhood being post-slavery, since the sexual objectification under slavery then becomes to stereotype black women as sexually promiscuous, or in some ways as a threat to that fairer idea of white women. So the stereotype becomes to be seen as black women as more likely to be prostitutes, or more likely to be less sexually responsible, or more likely to become single parents, and similar things. And this isn't why they're excluded from the feminist movement, but the feminist movement is an exclusively, or almost exclusively, white middle-class movement in the 1960s and 70s, and does not explicitly address the issues that may affect black women more than white women as well. So they become marginalized, but they're also marginalized by the black civil rights movement as well, led by people like Martin Luther King. And if you think about the kind of the March on Washington or the March on Selma, it's often John Lewis and all sorts of other people who are champions of civil rights, and they should be in those places too. But there's very little gender equality at the top of that civil rights movement. It's mainly men who are leading it and organizing it and setting the agenda for it. There are, of course, black women who are kind of champions here, and I've been talking about Mrs. America, the BBC. Well, it's on BBC, the HBO series about the Equal Rights Amendment, and that features Shirley Chisholm, who was an African American woman who was the first African American woman to try and win the Democratic nomination for president as well. But she's the exception rather than the rule. So, in order then to achieve equality, black women have to work not only against or just in general for women's rights, they have to work within the feminist movement to challenge the racism of white women. This is not to say that white women are necessarily an enemy, because I don't think Bell Hooks is thinking about this kind of network of privilege and oppression as like us versus them or enemies. But certainly black women have to persuade other people other than just men in order to get the freedoms that they need. And that means recognizing other sorts of layers of oppression and the way in which those forms of oppression interact as well. And Bell Hooks is really interested in the way in which the combination of oppression of being a woman and the oppression of being black together create more than the sum of its parts, more than just being black and being a woman, suffering racism and suffering sexism, but the two together make a black woman especially disadvantaged, especially oppressed, I think. Here I have, I've made some notes for you anyway, but as we're thinking about these, we're always, with our key thinkers this time, thinking about, well, what does this then tell us about the way they think about society or human nature and the state? And in this case, without dwelling on it too long, I've made some notes for you which look a bit like these, and they're on Classroom, and they're very similar to the ones I made on Simone de Beauvoir as well. So that you can lift these. If you get an essay on society or human nature or whatever, you can then apply them directly to those paragraphs. Okay. So with that in mind, let's think about Bell Hooks gets us on the way to thinking about this thing called intersectionality. And again, we've got Audre Lorde here reminding us that therefore there is no such thing as a single issue, because women don't live single issue lives, that women are not only women. They may be black, and their blackness in some contexts may be more important than something else, or their class may be more important than something else as well. And so one of the ways I try to get people to look at this is to look at this lady, Kimberly Crenshaw, who is credited with inventing the phrase intersectionality. I won't play the video here, you can play it for yourself, but I'd recommend watching the whole thing as well. But she starts with an experiment where she reads off a list of names and gets people in the audience to stand and only sit down if they haven't heard of the name before. And she begins with names like Michael Brown, Eric Garner, and Freddie Gray. And most of the audience are still standing. And these people are black men who've been killed by the police, usually unarmed. And these days we would add other people to those as well, almost every week. And then she reads off a list of women's names, and most of the audience sit down. And the only thing that separates their experience is gender. They've still been unfairly killed at the hands of the police, but we know more about the men than we do about the women. Now, there isn't a conspiracy involved there. It's not like black men or any men in particular have kind of deliberately kind of created this or stopped us talking about those women. It's that all of us in society have failed to recognize that we're more likely to talk about men than we are to talk about women. So once we begin to look at the way in which black women may be less likely to be taken account of, we begin to ask some questions about why that is. And what we're talking about here is the fact that whilst race is really, really important, the fact that their gender has intersected with that has made us less likely to know something bad happened to them. And maybe class might be another reason for that as well, in terms of us not being able to see their experience. Now, this looks pretty simplistic. So I normally ask what other kind of things people talk about. And they talk about things like sexuality, or they might talk about nationality. And so we might think about, and different types of nationalities may be more stigmatized or more demonized than others as well. So we could make this slightly more complicated, intersectionality, and then begin to talk about the layers of what if people experience more than one of these things? You know, if you are black and disabled and gay and also, transitioning or something similar, then that means there's a whole series of other ways in which you may experience oppression or which other people may have more privilege over you. We could still keep adding to the list, and eventually we might come up with something like this, and I expect we could probably go even beyond this one as well. That even among, for example, there's one on here about colorism. So even among people of ethnic minorities, and even among black people, and even among black people from the same community and the same culture, different tonal skin tone differences may also create a kind of ladder of privilege as well, and they may often be unspoken. Just that some people within that community may have found it easier to get a job, or some people in that community may be seen as more attractive by members of their own community as well. So this exercise then is a way of us seeing the complex web of privileges, the complex web of ways in which people may experience oppression, but which other people may get some sorts of advantages. So just to simplify it, we started with oppression as a woman, and we added into ethnicity as just one form of oppression. We could have added some others as well, class and nationality and so on. But we end up with something like, inverted commas, an ethnic woman, something which is a black woman, or something which is more than the sum of its parts, more than the sum of just a list of oppressions. Okay. There is, on this side, a flip side, because if we can understand that people are experiencing a list of oppressions, what if we made a list of privileges? And so some people are white, that gives them a certain amount of privilege. But what if they're white and middle class? What if they're white and middle class and privately educated? What if they're white and male and middle class and privately educated? What if they're white, male, middle class, privately educated and come from a particular country, let's say, for example, Britain? Then they may be quite far up the ladder of privileges. And that means that then we can understand, for example, how they've managed to be able to gain access to particular forms of employment. And then we might question as to, okay, what do we do to make that more inclusive? So there's a kind of usefulness in describing this intersectionality and the way in which privilege and oppression are related. So definitions-wise, this is what Kimberly Crenshaw talked about: a prism for seeing the way in which various forms of inequality operate together and exacerbate each other. And this is what I was talking about that was in the dictionary, finally, only in 2017. About 20 odd years between Kimberly Crenshaw coming up with it and it going into the dictionary. Why do you think that would be? So what do we think about this? And here I'm just going to make some very quick points, which in the end of your handouts, you've got a little table that says advantages and disadvantages of intersectionality. Very straightforward. Firstly, this is a really useful way of describing the fact that not all women suffer the same sorts of oppression. And I think we've covered that pretty clearly. And therefore, if we can't talk about one common experience, we probably shouldn't talk about one common goal either, which is great. But this can be divisive, and what it means is that we end up with, or we could end up with, a kind of competition for, who is more oppressed than who, and in order to claim the ability to be a leader of a movement, for example, or to have to set the agenda of a movement. And that's a problem, I think, that lots of feminists in the movement have found. Audre Lorde, for example, argued against seeing it as a kind of competition and said that there's no hierarchy of oppression. It can show different types of oppression can combine to create a new form. And the idea of being a black woman is not just about being black and about being a woman, but being described in a particular way and being portrayed and stereotyped in a particular way is useful for us to see how those two things combine. But it doesn't explain how each form can be fought and what we can do about it if the structure of creating those oppressions isn't clear to us because it's different for everybody. Then it's not as simple as simply doing what second wave feminists have done and concentrating on male patriarchy and the way in which that must be maybe torn down by all women. There's a subjectivity about this understanding of intersectionality, which is intended to give individual women a voice to talk about their own experience of oppression. From anyone's perspective who may be a woman or oppressed, they could say, well, look, you don't understand what it's like to be me. Let me tell you about what it's like to be me. And these are the barriers that I've faced. These are the kind of microaggressions that I experience on a day-to-day basis. So that subjectivity allows people to have some agency and some control over defining their own oppression and then taking some steps and getting other people to recognize what steps should be taken to get rid of it. But that can often make it difficult to unite because if you don't all share the same experience, then it's difficult to come up with some common goals or some common identity that people feel about how it should be tackled. It's also easy for some other people, for critics and for opponents, to challenge it by discrediting it as only being your experience and not a wider problem for the rest of society. It describes the privilege of some groups in society. This is what I think I mentioned before in that kind of equation, that once we begin not only to look at list of oppressions, but list of privileges, then we begin to understand how some people are much more advantaged than others. And that if we want to see that we want to create an equal society, we want to see how those advantages are often unfair, and we should do things to limit those unfair advantages in order to create more space for the rest of us. And they can be about gender, they can be about class, and all sorts of things. But that on its own won't explain why those people got to be in those positions in the first place, what the structural source of it might be. Okay, so this leads us to what is it then that third wave intersectional postmodern feminists would try and do? Bell Hooks came up with all sorts of ideas about including lots of other people and recognizing each other's oppression, and that being as a means to communication. And later on in other books, she ends up talking about love and about spirituality, and love as a kind of political thing as well. That love might be the thing which we use to include lots of people in a kind of family or a kind of conversation with each other, which sounds a bit woolly. It's not as simple as changing a law or seizing control of the state or something else. It relies on individuals talking to other individuals and including them in a movement. And that's why one of the ways in which third wave feminists and other postmodern feminists have talked about solutions is by looking at where power is. And as far as they're concerned, if power is in the way in which people are talked about, stereotyped, and oppressed by being culturally demonized, then the thing to do is to change the way in which we talk about people. And that's why feminists have used language as a weapon in order to eliminate sexist language, for example, to get other people to think about the language they use. So here I've introduced a few phrases for you, which are part of a lexicon, I suppose, of the language that feminists might use to challenge patriarchy. I've been doing some of it today, which is I've been mansplaining and introducing the word mansplaining. I think it's pretty brilliant because one of the things it does is get men to check their privilege and check their behavior. For centuries, men have been used to being the ones who occupy space, who occupy knowledge and say, look, I've got knowledge, you should listen to me. So using the language of mansplaining is intended to get people like me or men to check, okay, do we need to listen to what you've got to say here? Shouldn't you be giving time to some other people to say something here? Yes, you might be thinking by the time we get to the end of this video. So what I intend to do next week is to look at these words and see if you can work out what they mean, or indeed you can just go and look at the lexicon yourself. And then we'll crack on with our next bit of feminism. We're going to start to look at liberal feminism and socialist feminism and radical feminism. Okay, that's your lot on third wave intersectional feminism and bell hooks.